Hello everyone, it's Maz. Before we get to the excellent episode with Zeith and Ruben Stewart from the International Committee of the Red Cross, I just want to share some more good news. Last week, the Voices of War crossed a significant milestone of 50,000 downloads. In the podcasting world, this is a significant achievement and is one I'm immensely proud of. So thank you everyone for tuning in and listening. It is wonderful knowing that people get value out of these conversations. My next goal now is to increase the number of ratings and reviews of the podcast, as that will increase its visibility across the various podcasting platforms. And for this, I would really like your help. I would greatly appreciate it if you could spare 30 seconds to rate the show or write a quick review. And it's now super easy to do this. Just go to ratethispodcast.com/The Voices of War and follow the simple instructions. Your help will make the show more prominent and will therefore give me more punching power when approaching big names for appearances on the show. It's a win-win. So please do take the few seconds to rate or review the pod. And if you've missed the link, you'll find it at the top of the show notes. Okay, now let's get to this incredible chat with Zeith and Ruben Stewart from the ICRC. It's a long episode, but I assure you, it's well worth it. My guests today are Zeith and Ruben Stewart from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Abby is a legal advisor in ICRC's Arms and Conduct of Hostilities unit, where his work focuses on urban warfare and the conduct of hostilities more generally. Aside from ICRC, Abby spent more than a decade in the Australian Army as both a signals officer and a legal officer and served in operations in the Middle East. She also has experience with the United Nations and the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission. Abby holds a Master of Law in International Legal Studies. Ruben is a military and armed groups advisor in the ICRC unit that manages relations and dialogue with arms carriers. He focuses on non-state armed groups, battlefield behaviour, and new technologies. Before joining the ICRC, Ruben served as an infantry officer in the New Zealand Defence Force for 10 years and then spent 15 years in the Middle East, primarily working for the United Nations. Ruben holds a Master's in International Relations. Abby and Ruben join me today to discuss urban warfare, including aspects of international humanitarian law that seek to govern it, as well as issues related to conduct of combatants and impact of urban warfare on civilians affected by it. Abby and Ruben, thank you both for joining me on The Voices of War.
My pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me, Maz.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty of urban warfare, maybe we'll get a bit of a background for both of you. So how did you both find yourself working for the ICRC? And what motivated the move? And given that it's three of us, I'll just nominate initially until we kind of get the conversation flowing. So, Ruben, you're nodding. So why don't you start us off on this one?
Like all things, I think it was by mistake. In hindsight, career paths can look like it follows a fairly straight line, but I kind of bounced around, like you say, in the New Zealand Defence Force and then the UN. And then the ICRC offered an opportunity that was just too good to pass on, which included a move to Europe, which was a nice break after a long period in the field in the Middle East. So by accident, but very happy that occurred. Thanks.
A very welcome accident ending up in Geneva. So smart move. And what about yourself, Abby?
For me, I think I always wanted to be an IHL lawyer. I walked into defence recruiting when I was an 18-year-old undergrad law student, and I said, how can I become a military lawyer? I want to work on IHL. And they pretty quickly told me to go away and get a law degree. Eventually, I transferred over to legal corps full-time after spending some time as a reserve general service officer. And then some post-grad study kind of landed me overseas, and I worked for a couple of organizations that were kind of working on the implementation of IHL or the law of armed conflict in various ways. And then eventually that landed me over at the ICRC, and both sort of started for them in New York and then ended up in Geneva. So in working in a couple of different capacities for them. So
yeah. Wonderful. And again, what a wonderful spot, Geneva. So most people would know of the ICRC, of course, and what it broadly does, but most probably don't know how far and how broad its remit spans. Can you both explain to our listeners, how you understand the organization's purpose writ large, as well as your role within it? So how it fits in. Maybe we can start with you, Abby, this time.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so the ICRC has been around for a number of years. Its primary role is to prevent and reduce the humanitarian suffering of armed conflicts, and we do this in many different ways. We kind of take this approach called the prevention, protection, and assistance approach. It's a multidisciplinary one, and it ranges from a dialogue with belligerents and political authorities on how to better respect IHL, both before armed conflict occurs and then during armed conflict is really where our protection work happens, both in terms of in the conflict zone out there where hostilities are occurring, but also in places of detention, as well as in where places where displaced people are, whether it be in camps or displaced within cities. And then our assistance work, which is really focused on, restoring access to essential services and economic security and health types of activities. So it's a broad range. From my perspective as a lawyer at the ICRC, we really work on our role is one of promoting the positive, good faith interpretations of the laws of armed conflict, and ensuring, being a bit of a guardian of IHL in that sense.
Good faith interpretation. I think I'll come back to that because I do want to explore a little bit more what that means. But maybe, Ruben. So how does your role fit into ICRC's work?
So I work as part of the unit that does relations with arms carriers, and just to complement what Abby said, I think it's worth sort of articulating that ICRC started its life on the battlefield when our founder Henri Dunant was at the Battle of Solferino in 1859, and his immediate response was exactly as Abby outlined, which was delivery of assistance to those soldiers who were wounded, those who were prisoners. And then after a couple of years, obviously, the ICRC was established in 1863, and we saw the development of legal frameworks to help prevent or establish sort of the remediation measures that could be taken when conflict occurs. And so right from the very outset, the ICRC has been present on the battlefield, delivering assistance, trying to mitigate that effects through a legal framework by engaging with arms carriers. And so I belong to the unit that sort of focuses on that element. And by arms carriers, we're talking state armed forces, non-state armed groups, PMSCs, police, gendarmerie type units. So we're just continuing, both of us in our respective roles, that sort of that long tradition of ICRC's work in this area.
What does that mean to I guess, maintain dialogue and relations with armed groups? What does that actually look like? Because I mean, what I'm seeing in my head is, I mean, you're an educator, you're a negotiator, you're a coach almost, as well as an adjudicator, but also you have the international, I guess, stick of judgment with you as part of ICRC. So what does that role actually mean?
Oh, I think you had me up until when you said we carry the stick. So all of the other roles that you talked about, that's exactly what we do. And our primary role within my particular unit is to disseminate and promote the adherence and respect for IHL. So that engagement can be as simple as standing in front of a class and delivering a lecture on IHL, or it could be long-term engagement, looking at the doctrine of an armed force, providing recommendations on how their practices can better comply with IHL. Reviewing some of the activities that are being undertaken, and this is the sort of protection approach that Abby was referring to, where we look at a specific event on the ground and say, okay, we think that could have been done in a way that would make it more legally compliant, and we'll have that discussion with the arms carriers to make those recommendations to them.
Okay, yeah, and I guess this is where Abby's work comes into it, and I guess this is the the good faith interpretation. It might be a good time to ask about that, because it seems to me highly subjective. Even the terminology good faith interpretation is obviously highly subjective. So what does that actually mean? And when you're trying to, I guess, interpret conduct in war as a lawyer, what does good faith interpretation mean? It strikes me as a loosely defined term that's perhaps slightly slippery, and perhaps by design.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Maz, and I think I think what we need to remember is that all the IHL really started in treaties or international conventions, and naturally all international treaties and conventions are only formed after significant negotiation. And when you eventually conclude a treaty, it's not always perfect. Some words in it are not well defined, and sometimes that's deliberate. And for the most part, I think it is fair to say all the IHL treaties, at least the 4 Geneva Conventions, well, all of the states have signed up to that, so they accept the substance of what are in those treaties, and for the most part, the majority of states have signed up to those additional protocols that apply specifically to the conduct of hostilities. And for even those states that haven't signed up to those additional protocols, well, all of them accept that they are bound by the fundamental rules on IHL by way of customary international law in a non-international armed conflict and an international armed conflict. Now, they may not always agree with the ICRC on how you interpret the rules, and sometimes they don't even agree with each other. And that's to be expected. There are clear kind of concepts, even in, when we think about proportionality, right? Concepts of military advantage and excessiveness and incidental harm. So we have a view on how to look at those those concepts and principles and apply them to certain situations. And folks don't always agree with us. And part of our work is to engage closely with states and parties to armed conflict to try and reach a more consistent understanding of how these rules could be applied in particular situations. And when we talk about thinking about applying IHL in good faith, well, really, it's about coming back to the key principles and reasons for why IHL exists in the first place. And that's for protecting those that aren't participating in hostilities, and protecting those that are no longer participating in hostilities, such as those that are rendered hors de combat by their wounds or sickness, detained, or they surrender. I think one of the things I like to emphasize, though, is that it is very important to reach legal agreement on how you think about the treaty terms that were concluded. It really matters when those words are taken out of the books and into military operations themselves. And so operationalization of the rules and principles into doctrine, training, planning, and conduct is really important. And I think if I could use just one example is the principle of precautions. It is one of my favorite IHL principles governing the rules on hostilities, and it applies to both attacking and defending parties. So basically that principle and the rules that underpin it require attacking parties to do a number of things related to target verification, the type of weapons and tactics you use, and then issuing of warnings to the civilian population. And then when you're in the defense, there are a number of things that need to happen to segregate the civilian population that's under your control from military operations, and then to take measures to protect them. Now, when it comes to the principle of precautions, any precaution that is feasible to protect civilians must be taken. But what do we mean? What do we mean by this term feasible? Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so for us and for all states, the rule is when you are considering what is feasible, you need to consider all of the humanitarian and military considerations that are relevant at the time. And when it comes to conducting military operations, what's feasible is going to depend a lot on decisions that are made well before a military operation kicks off. And a lot of those decisions are being made at the operational and strategic levels, particularly in terms of resource allocation, force composition, even the rules of engagement and the particular command and control measures that are in place for a particular operation. And your targeting process is probably is a great example of that. So it's all in the operationalization is really what I would like to stress there.
Yeah, and absolutely, that all makes sense, and especially when you start thinking about good faith and how deeply they can actually go down into even the tactical space. Good faith. The embedded assumption of good faith is that the person giving the order, pulling the trigger, commanding the operation, is going to act in good faith. In other words, is going to have the interests of the non-combatants in mind, and actually subscribing and accepting the Geneva Conventions as a guardrail for the conduct of war. And I guess that's the challenge, and that's probably where both of you spend most of your time is to convince belligerents, whether through liaison or through legal, I guess, policies and matters, that there is a right way and a wrong way to carry out certainly the most gruesome activity that humankind has invented. But that's also then brings me to, I guess, a particular operational area, and that is urban warfare, which we've come to know and have seen, especially over the last 76 days as well, its impacts. Before we get into specifics of urban warfare, maybe we can get a definition of what we mean when we say urban warfare, and explore some of its characteristics. And I think, Abby, you might be best placed to lead us off on this, and then we can go across to Ruben as well.
You've asked the $1 million question, Maz. How do we define urban warfare? Well, there is no universal.
I went to the lawyer first on this one, and
well, you won't find it in the law, that's for sure. But I'm not sure you'll find it in military doctrine either, because I think, or even policy, or at the international or domestic level, because there is no universal definition. It's certainly, it's easy to spot an urban battle when you see one, particularly if it's of high intensity. So, Grozny, Mosul, Aleppo, Marawi, Mariupol, the list goes on. But, urban warfare doesn't need to always be of high intensity. It takes many faces and forms. And similarly, what happens outside an urban setting can impact what happens inside of it. And vice versa. So at the ICRC, we really think of urban warfare in a broad sense. We are talking about any hostilities in urban areas, as well as those military operations that are during armed conflict that affect urban areas. So that could include a siege around an urban area. It might include hostilities that damage critical infrastructure in the countryside, but that might affect delivery of urban services. And when it comes to terms like urban area, urban settings, and cities, we use them interchangeably, really to refer to a complex, densely built and populated area that has an influence over a larger area. And it can include urban centers of various sizes. And so that's, there is no definition of urban warfare. It's hard to define what is the urban. But when it comes to the key characteristics of urban warfare, I think it's really clear to say that it is one of the most destructive and resource-intensive forms of warfare. Belligerents tend to operate in a highly decentralized manner, sometimes and often alongside partners and coalitions. You see a lot of really old traditional types of weapons and tactics being used, a lot of siege and encirclement, tunnels, booby traps, artillery, mortars, snipers, and the like. And then you see those types of traditional methods being complemented by more modern capabilities, such as new technologies of warfare and precision. There is a huge effort to dominate the information environment, to assert control and influence the public. And then what is of most concern to the ICRC is really the fact that it is fought amongst a huge presence of the civilian population. And it gives rise to a number of really devastating humanitarian consequences.
Yeah, which we'll definitely get into. But most of that spoke to me. It's very close to my heart as a child of the war in Bosnia and having lived through a little bit of the war in Sarajevo, which still is the longest siege in modern history. When you say urban warfare and urban is anything that controls a larger area. I mean, Sarajevo is the capital of Bosnia, and it was about choking down Sarajevo because if Sarajevo fell, Bosnia fell. That really is very close to my heart. But we also know that urban warfare is also nothing new. We've seen its devastating effects over the recent decades in some of the cities that you mentioned, and we're seeing it play out, right now in Ukraine. In fact, literally right now, Mariupol is being decimated as we speak, as are many other parts of particularly eastern Ukraine. So what is it about cities that makes them strategically and militarily important? I mean, I've made my own conclusions here just when referring to Sarajevo, but based on your experience, and maybe we can go across to Ruben first for this one.
So there's obvious sort of strategic and tactical advantages to urban areas. Well, I think I'll leave that to Abby to cover. One element that's particularly interesting to me, and that's because of my work on non-state armed groups, and this is how they or in one way that they differ from state armed forces, is that they draw a lot of their support and administrative functions from urban areas. They don't have, a CSS function. They don't have logistics chains to support them. So they will use urban areas almost as a logistics base, as a recruiting base, as a funding base, because that's where, the majority of the population can be gathered. So in regards to recruitment, I mean, urban areas, or, I think you've probably heard the phrase feral cities being used. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're talking about large numbers of disadvantaged, primarily youths, often unemployed men, can be really fertile recruiting grounds for non-state armed groups. And that predates back to, the 20th century, where trade unions and student groups, were, a large part of those non-state armed groups. In terms of funding, if you want to conduct fundraising activities, then you would obviously do that in a place that has the largest population. So if it's, and sometimes through criminal activities, be extortion or bank robberies or kidnappings, then urban areas can offer you a source of funding. Logistics-wise, a lot of NSAGs make use of commercial off-the-shelf technologies, be it handheld drones, mobile phones. So those are easier to procure in urban areas, and they're also easier to be fixed and repaired and modified in urban areas where you find those technicians. So, the technician who's going to modify your, establish your network, mechanic who's going to build your VBID, for example, are more likely to be found in urban areas. So there's a number of areas where NSAGs would want to conduct urban operations, but for the strategic and tactical, I think I'll leave that to Abby.
Yeah, sure. Abby?
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely, as you said, seen a real increase in urban warfare. I mean, people have fought in cities from the moment they began building them, but particularly in the last few decades. And, and we're only going to see this increase. And I think you can put it down to three. You could generally summarize, three key reasons. And the first one being demographics. We have more than half of the world's population living in cities already, and this is only going to grow to 70% by about 2050, or at least that's what the UN projects. And then, so when we have cities growing vertically and populations becoming denser, we know they're going to become more increasingly congested, complex, and interdependent. So demographics is a big thing. The other point is, the strategic value of cities, and you've already touched upon it, right? They are an embodiment of national identity, a core hub of people, power, economic activity, history, social institutions, and culture. So they do have really strategic value. And then when it comes to belligerent strategy, well, there are a lot of reasons as to why one might drive fighting to the urban area. And Ruben raised a lot of them there, particularly in the context of non-state armed groups. And when you think about the physical and human terrain that a city offers, well, it offers a lot of advantages to a defender, especially when they're facing a numerically or technologically superior opponent. At the same time, the attacker might use the city in order to isolate a defender within the city in order to prevent their escape. including by resorting to siege or encirclement. And there's some really interesting stuff being written by Lieutenant Colonel Amos Fox over at the US Army about the increase in siege or encirclement tactics in contemporary urban warfare. And so I would encourage you to take a look at that. It's really interesting arguments. The other point as to why one might draw fighting into an urban area is combat density. And there is an excellent book written by Professor Anthony King over at the University of Warwick, who kind of looks at urban warfare and how it's been conducted, particularly more recently, and then projects how it's going to be conducted in the 21st century. And really, he kind of makes this argument, which is quite compelling, to say, many modern militaries are much smaller these days for a number of reasons, and they can't amass the type of frontages and conduct the open battle that was most common in the 20th century. And it's clear they also can't envelop or inundate entire cities. So what you are going to increasingly see is a convergence of military operations onto decisive points, and they will be primarily located in urban areas in future conflict. So but it's a great book and I would encourage you to take a look at that one as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing those resources. I absolutely will. I mean, it's and they might get an invite for a podcast as well. But it's you mentioned that it's kind of changed over the last number of decades, and the principal change, as you've just gone through, is the main one is, I guess, the demographics. Right, more of us live in cities, which I guess is makes it more difficult to both police but also to uphold IHL, International Humanitarian Law. So firstly, and this is maybe to Abby again, and then we'll go across to Ruben, but what is the role of IHL in urban warfare, and what can IHL even offer us in such a complex and such a dense environment? And then we'll go across to Ruben maybe for the sort of more practitioner level, I guess, understanding what you see from the armed groups you speak to on the ground.
I think what IHL can offer us, in armed conflict and urban warfare generally, is a lot, I would say. I mean, it's probably no surprise that I say that because I'm an IHL lawyer
you need
working
a job.
for the ICRC. Yeah, otherwise I'd be out of a job. But, when it comes to the IHL rules on the conduct of hostilities, so distinction, proportionality, and precautions, as you know very well, they are all about protecting civilians from fighting. And they are the most important when it comes to fighting in urban areas. And, we, as I said before, I mean, urban warfare is one of the most destructive forms of fighting, and not just for civilians, but also for combatants. And it's an incredibly difficult form of fighting, both from a legal, moral, and strategic perspective. The urban battle space is very complex and multidimensional. And you've got combatants or soldiers who are having to think about what's above ground, underground, in buildings, and they're often in harm's way while they're doing that. So it is really difficult to comply with IHL just simply because of the density of the civilian population and the infrastructure and their proximity to military objectives. But that's what makes it even more important to try. I think. The other thing that's not that I would like to sort of mention is, when it comes to fighting in cities, it brings with it a really heavy sustainment burden, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. And by this, I don't just mean what's required to defeat an adversary, but also to respect various legal and humanitarian imperatives. And so, we can think of things like providing for the needs of the displaced, safe evacuation routes for civilians, medical care to the wounded and sick, both civilians and combatants, protection of captured personnel, so the handling of human remains, the list goes on. And they're all clear IHL obligations, but they are heavy sustainment challenges for forces.
Yeah. Ruben?
And sort of outside the remit, but continuing the sustainment is obviously the reconstruction piece afterwards as well, which is something that the military forces, have to keep in mind. The bill for the reconstruction of Mosul was in the tens of billions of dollars for a relatively short 9-month battle, and so if there are elements of the conduct that help reduce civilian harm by reducing the damage to civilian objects, which brings it in compliance with IHL, there are also benefits in regards to the reconstruction and reparation costs post-battle as well.
And I guess the reconnection of severed ties between the local populations, I guess, is probably another aspect of IHL or why adherence to IHL. So not just rebuilding the physical, but also rebuilding the emotional and the social capital that's been absolutely decimated, especially in urban warfare. Have you had any experience with that, Ruben?
So again, slightly outside the remit of IHL, but during the battle for Mosul, I think the ISIS takeover of Mosul in 2014 was very much due to a breakdown of the relationship between Moslawis and the government of Iraq, and part of their conduct during that battle was to ensure that, firstly, that they rescued the Moslawis from ISIS, and they did it, or tried to do it, in such a way that they rebuilt the relationship by ensuring that civilian considerations were built into the operation from the outset and during their conduct. And they realized that this was the first step in a long process of re-establishing government authority, and that was going to be on the basis of respect and trust, and it couldn't be coerced. And that was a very important element in shaping how the Iraqi security forces conducted their operation in that area. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that strikes me as I guess particularly difficult, and I guess for both of you from your jobs, it's we often assume that IHL hates their rules of war, conduct of war. We need to follow them. But that feels to me like it's almost a throwaway, because the environment of war is such that IHL doesn't always feature at the forefront of your mind, especially when we're talking urban warfare, like you said, Abby, where you just don't know, you've got, above you, below you, next to you, potential threats. You've got IEDs, you've got snipers, you've got mortars, artillery, tanks, civilians, et cetera, et cetera. It's such a complex environment. So again, maybe I'll throw across to you, Ruben, but what is it about war, or at least through your liaison and contact with armed groups, what is it about war that makes combatants forget or disregard IHL, or why is it so difficult to implant IHL into a combatant, whether from a recognized armed force or especially a non-established, non-state armed group?
Well, that's that's the $2 million question right there. So I think it's looking at how violence is employed. It's worth sort of looking at it, I think, on a bit of a spectrum. So at one end, we'll have strategic violence. That's where violence is employed deliberately. It's sanctioned at the highest levels. For example, acts of terrorism would be strategic violence. That's for that purpose. And then we have sort of opportunistic violence, which is violence is conducted by soldiers at the lowest level. It's not sanctioned by commanders. It would be punished by commanders if it was found out that was occurring. And that could include looting, for example, or elements like that. And then there's sort of what Devorah Manikin at Hebrew University has termed ultrapreneurial violence, which is the violence that occurs with the knowledge, especially of mid-level commanders, but is not sanctioned, is not punished in any way when it occurs. Indeed, sometimes it can be encouraged because those mid-level commanders think that is a better way of undertaking operations. So there's those elements about, and that's where there's a level of command and control engagement in the application of violence. But I think when it comes to the individual, and I think this is where you're pointing towards at the first part of your question, is that we know that when the rounds start flying, our focus tends to narrow really quickly and quite considerably. And that a lot of the judgments that we make, our moral judgments, are automatic and intuitive. They're not so rational or deliberative. And And stress has a large part to play when those in reducing our rational decision making. There are visceral states that exist, be it our fight for survival, hunger, fear, anger. These are all emotions or visceral states that can cause us to take actions that might be illegal. There are other emotions in terms of a determination to be fair. For most people, there's not a desire to harm others. We can have loyalty to a peer group, and these can offset some of the other states that I talked about. But there are, and then I guess there's also underlying conditions as to why soldiers or commanders might contravene IHL as well. But there's a vast number of reasons. Not all of those can be built into our system of disseminating IHL, but certainly the way that a soldier conducts themselves on the battlefield is an important consideration for us to understand. And one of the reasons, for example, that the unit that I belong to is almost entirely recruited from former service personnel is that we have been in that position. We've heard the crack and thump. We've had the dust on our boots, and so when we're engaging with militaries, we're engaging from a position of we've been in your position. We understand the challenges. However, it is possible, and here are some examples on how to do it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but I suspect it's far easier speaking to recognized militaries than non-state armed groups. Would that be accurate?
Not entirely.
Okay.
I think you've got to view all arms carriers as having a lot of similarities. They are obviously conducting conflict. As we know, the nature of war is it's violent, it's iterative, it's political in its undertaking. So the nature of the conflict is the same. The normative framework that applies in those settings is the same for both sides as well. So as Abby was saying, if it's a non-international armed conflict that involves, for example, a non-state armed group and a state armed force on another, the same legal framework applies to both. So the content of our engagement with those groups and those circumstances is generally on the same matters. And it comes down to the distinction, the proportionality, and the precautions that they undertake in their activities. The manner in which we would engage them may differ slightly with a state armed force. Obviously, ICRC is present in a country at the knowledge of a state, and therefore through state channels, we're able to establish contact with the state armed force. A non-state armed group might be achieved through the communities that we're delivering assistance to, because the non-state armed group has closer ties with those community. They might have some of their personnel who are in detention that we visit as part of our detention visits. Or it might be that our convoys, run into non-state armed group checkpoints as they are moving through whatever area that we're operating in, and that is the way that contact is established. So in that way, establishing the contact can be difficult, but often our engagement then follows a similar process. We have to establish our bona fides. We have to explain to all of the arms carriers, our humanitarian principles and how those shape how we act. That is that we are neutral, we're impartial, we're a humanitarian organization, so we don't take sides. We're not going to take a personal perspective. We're there for those that have become victims of conflict, be they civilians or be those combatants or fighters who can no longer participate in the battle for whatever reason. So a lot of it comes down to us acting in the same way that we preach, so people can see that we are neutral, we are impartial, and from there the dialogue continues, and it's very similar between state armed forces and non-state armed groups, albeit sometimes reaching a non-state armed group can be a wee bit more difficult than just trotting off an email or a phone call to someone at a military headquarters.
Yeah. And Abby, do you also do any kind of engagement with belligerents in the legal sense?
Yeah, absolutely. All the time, actually. It's I engage mostly with militaries and also civilian government officials, particularly on my work on urban warfare, which is why I work so closely with Ruben's unit, because very often we tend to work together on some of these issues. I think probably one example that I use, and it's shameless promotion on the podcast, is a publication that we published late last year called the Commander's Handbook on Reducing Civilian Harm in Urban Warfare.
Excellent.
So the drafting of that publication was led by Ruben's unit, but it involved a number of colleagues within house. And it basically is the result of a lengthy study of a number of urban battles over a series of decades, and also extensive engagement with armed forces, state armed forces, to really kind of discuss with them, some of their practices, both good and bad, and the ways in which they could better protect civilians. And we drew a lot on a number of good practices that state armed forces have been using in recent conflicts to kind of, and our own recommendations that we've had for a number of years to really come up with this publication. And the beauty of it, I think, is that it's actually not very long, because I don't know about you, but when I was in uniform, I wouldn't often read doctrine. So particularly if it's long. So, and really this kind of publication sets out a number of good practice recommendations on doctrine, training, policy, and conduct on how to reduce harm in urban warfare. And that only came about from engaging with militaries across the globe. And then within the legal division itself, we engage all the time, both with JAGs as well as uniformed personnel. I think it's especially important when doing work on the conduct of hostilities, because we really need to have these robust conversations with militaries to understand where they're coming from, to understand the challenges that they are facing. When it comes to tackling what is a very complex or wicked problem. And I know that Ruben sort of talked a lot about the considerations for the soldier at the individual tactical level when they are, in an incredibly dangerous environment that is the urban. But it's also, I think it's really important not to forget that, the strategic and the operational levels they make a lot of really important decisions before that phase of hostilities that affect what happens in the urban battle. And
what do you mean? Explore that a little more, because I think that strikes me as a particularly important point.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I mentioned Lieutenant Colonel Amos Fox earlier, who's written a lot of great stuff. He's put out a pretty provocative argument, I think, as well as Anthony King, and they sort of say, hey, particularly Western militaries, you've trained and you've got and focused on war fighting that has this idea of maneuver at its sort of as the center of war fighting. Like, you need to maneuver through the battle space, and war needs to be fast and violent. And then, but it's all that whole concept is turned on its head when you end up in a city and it becomes a grinding attritional battle where you fight street by street. You've got sort of micro sieges or encirclements, and the battle really does slow down, and it ends up being not the battle you're prepared for. And you're only as good as the preparations that you had before in terms of thinking about some of these challenges, particularly when it comes to civilian harm, right? So, one of the things that we emphasize a lot in urban when it comes to urban battles is, civilians cannot be trapped. They must not be trapped. They need to be able to have the option to leave if they want to. They need safe passage out. And sometimes, we might say that parties to armed conflict are legally obliged to evacuate civilians in certain circumstances, right? Evacuation doesn't just happen out of nowhere. They are really complex operations involving a lot of actors and a lot of planning and coordination that needs to be thought about at a level above the tactical level. So kind of thinking about the types of decisions that need to be made in the phase 0 or the shaping phases of military operations to ensure that when it comes to phase 4, things aren't as bad as they are. So that's kind of what I mean by that.
Yeah. No, that's
and I'd also sorry.
No, please go on.
I'd take it even beyond phase 0. And in terms of, if we look back about the writing of doctrine, the training, the equipping of a force, these can all help set a military force up for better success when it comes to the protection of civilians. An example I like to use again is back in Mosul, where the counterterrorism service was given one of the primary roles in retaking Mosul. The counterterrorism service was established as a hostage recovery force, a counterterrorism type force to kick in doors, clear rooms, take buildings, and were then tasked with a very conventional task of recapturing a city. In fact, it wasn't recapturing a city; it was rescuing Mislawis from the Islamic State group. And they very much approached it in the same way that their training had set them out to do. So their mindset, their training, they then carried over into a very conventional operation, which is, we're here to rescue those civilians. So from the moment a CTS trooper joined the CTS, it was drilled into them that we're here to rescue civilians. We're here to rescue hostages. So every element of their training, their equipping, their and also the support they got from partnered military forces was to develop those instincts. The muscle memory, the trigger discipline is all focused on, is that person a civilian or a combatant? Because at the end of the day, the recovery of those hostages or the recovery of those civilians is what's going to determine mission success. So that mindset can occur years before a battle was undertaken. But again, as Abby was saying, they have to build on each other. You can't have that mindset years before a battle unless you're going to follow it through in the planning and then phase 0 through to phase 4.
And embody it. I mean, that's very interesting. That triggers something. I recently had an interview with Tony Ingerson, who's a Swedish researcher on cultures and subcultures, particularly with the behaviors at the tactical level, so in combat. And he looked at both kind of heroic but also atrocities. And he talks about, very much what you're describing there. The subculture that a unit will embody and live is shaped, well, even before phase 0. I mean, it's shaped at the recruit level, where you start the non-conscious programming inside that person's behavior so that they don't have to think, they just act out of instinct, as opposed to a cognitive process that, as you rightly pointed out before, under high stress, tunnel vision kicks in, heart rate goes up, sweaty palms and a lot. There's not much thinking going on. It's gross motor skills and instinct takes over, which I guess kind of really makes sense about, why we drill things in the military. But what difference have you observed between the conduct of militaries who have trained, and have, I guess, the protection of civilians inculcated in their unit culture or subculture versus those who don't? I mean, is there can you actually point your finger and say there's a distinct difference with the way they approach war or combat?
For training is absolutely critical in ingraining, the theoretical underpinnings of what a military force, and their values and norms that they say that they're all about. I mean, we know from adult education, for example, that, if you're going to attend a lecture, you're going to retain 5% of the knowledge. If you're going to read, you retain 10%. I mean, that simply is unacceptable. You're never going to pass an exam if you just read or listen to a lecture. There has to be follow-up. And so what we're aiming for example, is when it comes down to training. And if you're going to practice what it is that you're taught, then your retention levels jump up to 75, 80%. So if we're serious about the protection of civilians, then it can't be something that is reflected in doctrine, which is often read but very rarely practiced. And it can't just be taught in a classroom. You've got to go out there and you've got to practice these scenarios. And the CTS example in Iraq is a good one, where you've got a counterterrorism or a hostage recovery force where they run those drills ad nauseum, and they do that in such a way that they are prepared for what it is that they're going to be undertaking. And they will have civilian role players, in those rooms, acting as civilians would and responding as civilian would. Unfortunately, when we see a lot of urban training facilities, the civilian presence is superficial and almost token, and don't reflect the population densities that we see. And if you're going to run an urban training event, and you don't have a civilian presence there, it's almost like running jungle warfare training in the desert. It's absurd to think you can train for an urban environment without having civilians there.
Yeah, no, that's as you were talking there, I'm reminded of my physics teacher back from high school. He had above the chalkboard, he had written, "I hear, I forget, I see, I remember, I do, I understand." And I don't know whose quote that is. I know it's a famous quote. I just can't think of who said it, but it's always stuck with me, and that makes absolute sense, because it's that's absolutely how we need to approach. And this again speaks to that culture in inculcating these the desired behaviors. It's funny you both keep mentioning doctrine, and I keep trying to avoid the very obvious fact that I actually work in the unit now that's responsible for the project managing the writing and updating of much of our army doctrine. But I do have to admit, though, that I've had a look at the handbook, the Commander's Handbook to Urban Warfare that you mentioned, Abby, and have already shared it with some of my peers. Because we're certainly looking to include some of those aspects into our revised ADF doctrine. So that's while you said it's a plug, it's not a shameless plug, and it certainly should be said loud and clear. These are absolutely important aspects of war that we don't unfortunately often talk about. Yeah, sorry, Abby.
That's great. So that's great to hear. And I forgot to mention, we were incredibly grateful for the opportunity to engage with some very experienced ADF officials during the consultations to elaborate that handbook. And a lot of the insight that they had from their real, and quite recent experience was integral to producing that publication.
Yeah, and I also echo the point, and this is something that's been recognised at the highest level of defence as well, that doctrine is, very rarely read because it's so long and it's verbose. And, there's been research on the level of literacy one needs to have to read some of our publications, and it was, tertiary level training to be able to understand, which is not where it needs to be. If we want our soldiers to be, referring to these documents and to be the go-to handbooks for them, then they need to be written in a language that speaks to the audience, as opposed to you shouldn't need a PhD to read a publication and understand what it's trying to say. I should say that even now I'll do a plug for one of your ADF's own publications, Charles Knight. Or Lieutenant Colonel Charles Knight, or he might be Colonel. Sorry, don't want to get that wrong there. Over SO1 of urban operations, his team produced this really great compendium of urban warfare, urban operations, academic doctrine, a whole bunch of publications. It's a huge compendium, and I found that incredibly useful. It's all of the great all of really good urban warfare stuff in one place. So yeah, it's I think it's on the Cove website or one of it's and again, I don't want to harp on about doctrine, but it is one of those things that's even in my previous army career, I used to shy away from it because for all the reasons we mentioned. But it's fundamentally important, and while we can laugh it off as doctrine is boring or whatever, but it really underpins everything that it sets the guardrails and the tone that a military will then embody in its training and then live, and of course, doctrine is merely a guide, but it's the fundamental building blocks before you can get creative. To go straight to the creative part without actually understanding the building blocks that have been built over centuries in some cases, is where potentially things can really go wrong. But I think we've touched on a particular aspect of conflict that's again near and dear to my heart, and that is culture and different cultural values. How do we account for different cultural, I guess, norms and behaviors, expectations when teaching IHL? And perhaps we can start with Ruben here, and then, of course, get Abby's view as well.
So understanding culture, and let's use the broadest definition of culture we possibly can. We're talking about the norms and values of the community. We're talking about religious and spiritual beliefs. We're talking about those unspoken etiquette or sort of rules of societal interaction that are unwritten, but can be extremely strong. So and obviously there's a study by ICRC. We were very prolific at doing research into elements like this. So we conducted a study in 2018 called Roots of Restraint, which looked at the influences that can complement IHL. And that sort of kicked off a long line of work where, especially in regards to religious and spiritual beliefs, we've looked at the complementarity of Islam and IHL. We looked and have published quite a bit recently on Buddhism. But obviously there's some of the early work on IHL was driven by these religious values that have existed for millennia, and they were codified in religious teachings, practiced, and then obviously became part of from the early 19th century into the body that we now know as IHL. So a lot of IHL can find its history and some of those religious and spiritual beliefs. In fact, it's interesting, some of the concepts that occur in IHL, such as that prisoners should be treated honourably, reflect the age of knights and chivalry in terms of how prisoners are to be captured. And as you rightly note, these influences still pervade today to varying degrees, and militaries go to great efforts, as all three of us know, of when we join about teaching the history and the elements that make up military culture, the pride, the professionalism, the courage, the honor, the integrity that all makes up a professional military practitioner. But there's a key element in that. There's within that, which is being professional means being technically proficient, for example, and a technically proficient sort of combatant is more likely to accurately employ their weapon system than someone who is not professional. And that's strange coming from a humanitarian, but if you know your skill and your trade, then you can more accurately direct that in a way that prevents civilian harm occurring. But in regards to some more civilian culture, I mean, and these don't have to be written in religious tracts or fatwas or hadithas. There are norms that have existed within societies, back to tribal times, that certain elements of society are protected. They should not be targeted. They do not take part in hostilities. A few years ago, one of our FAS delegates, the Unit for Arms Relations, was talking to cattle herders down in South Sudan, where they were wrestling. And he sort of asked the question. He knew the answer, but he asked the question. It's like, well, can that old man over there, can he be part of the wrestling match? He was told, no, you can't. Don't be ridiculous. And what about this young boy? Or what about this lady? No, of course not. And so he obviously pointed out that, well, the same rules that you have for wrestling apply in IHL. There are protected people who must not be targeted. And if we can find opportunities, and that does take a knowledge of the local context and the environment in which you're operating, plus a knowledge of, like I said, the military cultures and subcultures that exist, to identify those parallels that we can then use to highlight IHL and how it's not new. These are the principles of IHL, and even some of the specific rules, date back centuries and millennia.
Yeah, and I guess it makes sense why it then also transcends any particular national or unit culture, because it's no one sets out to be become a war criminal, and we all intuitively understand and know what's right or what's wrong. We know who should be part of this wrestling match or this war, and who might not. But inevitably, and we're seeing it play out right now, not all belligerents will adopt that position, that civilians shouldn't be harmed, because civilians can become, and are right now, a strategic target, to suppress an identity, to suppress resistance, to stage false flag operations, so on and so forth. And of course, it's not happening just now, it's happening before. It's happened before. It certainly has happened in Bosnia, where the intention was to kill civilians, to then blame the victims for killing their own, basically to stage a false flag operation. And of course, famously in Sarajevo, the bombing of shelling of a marketplace, where the Serb army was accusing the Bosnians of killing their own people, to then go to the UN and cry, which of course was proven wrong. But this is not, this is something that happens all the time. So how do we convince combatants who are not interested in IHL, or don't care about IHL, or are going against it because it's in their interest? What have you found to be effective, I guess, and what's not? And I want to hear from both of you on this as well, if possible. But I know, Ruben, in your case, you've spoken to belligerents. So how do you speak to armed groups, and maybe I'm guessing here, but I suspect you've also spoken to some who we would consider otherwise terrorists. How do you convince them that they're targeting, which terrorism is targeting civilians for political aims? How do you convince them that that's actually, firstly, illegal, and secondly, that it's actually in their interest to protect civilians?
So there can be a variety of approaches that can be taken in that regard. For a number of non-state armed groups, compliance with IHL can be seen as a sort of road to legitimacy. And if they're seen to comply, that they build this into their own sort of codes of conduct, that they punish people, for example, who may transgress, that can be seen that they are a responsible force. They are fulfilling some of the elements of statehood that they are aspiring to. However, other non-state armed groups are trying to do away with the existing order. They don't want to sign up to the international order. They want to do away with it completely. And therefore, that's where we really need to find what it is that defines them. And that sort of underpins, obviously, why a lot of our work on religion and IHL, because some people can identify more with divine law than man-made law, using their phrasing. So if we can identify, the language and religious teachings which complement IHL, which lay out many of the same elements, and the Quran is a good example. The Torah does it as well, and many of the teachings in other religions, actually support and underpin IHL. So we can have a discussion that lays out the rules without actually referring to IHL. There are other arguments that can be used. A story that I use to underpin the civilians that have agency during urban battles as well is that during the battle for Mosul, we know, for example, that some of the Iraqi ISIS fighters pushed back on some of the tactics being employed by the foreign fighters from the Islamic State, because they considered those tactics, and it was primarily through the placement of IEDs, to be too detrimental to, the family and friends of the Iraqi fighters who were the people living in that exact city. And the result was we did see a lot less IEDs being deployed and utilized. This is static IEDs, not VBIDs, in Mosul than we did in Fallujah and Ramadi, for example. So it can be, the argument can be as simple as like, well, how about your own families? How about your own communities? And you could go to the extreme and say, well, targeting civilians can be a waste of resources. What are you achieving by targeting civilians? There's a perfectly valid military target that you can direct your attention and resources to. Why would you expend those resources on civilians? That is just going to generate ill will towards you. You're going to, as state armed forces found themselves in Afghanistan and Iraq, if you harm civilians, then your support dries up. The source of intelligence dries up, and it can be can undermine your mission completely if you don't take care of civilians. And of course, added to that now, almost every person in the world has a mobile media device in their pocket that can record, edit, and disseminate information. And you've mentioned, recent conflicts, but we've started to see this occur more and more, especially in some of the conflicts in the Middle East, and especially in places where mobile phone coverage and internet coverage is so high. Is that the way that civilians are treated can reach the world stage in a matter of seconds from that incident occurring.
Yeah, and I definitely do want to get to the technology piece, but I just want to give Abby a chance to also jump in on this kind of engagement piece with those who are seemingly uninterested.
Yeah, I think I might take the question in a slightly different direction, just because so often when we discuss IHL with people, we often hear that, whether it be armed actors, political actors, or otherwise, we often are confronted with this skepticism on the significance of the law. And we hear some of the things that you said before, well, they're terrorists, so the law doesn't apply to them, or they don't respect the rules, so why should we? Well, the rules that were made a number of years ago aren't relevant to wars today. And I think when you combine that negative discourse with the media reports we see of various atrocities in conflict zones, it can kind of lead us to really question, like, what is the relevance of the law today, right, in modern warfare? And for the ICRC, I mean, we kind of stress that, this recurring discourse that IHL is always violated and therefore useless is not only wrong, it's dangerous. And, of course, we know that violations occur. We know that many of them are deliberate and suffering does follow. But if you kind of have these really negative perceptions on the utility of IHL, it can create an environment where violations can become more acceptable. And then the normalization of violations can have a terrible impact on persons affected by armed conflict. And I think what I would like to stress is that, the reality is much more nuanced than what you see in the media. There is daily evidence of IHL compliance by belligerents. And, what we don't see that every day in armed conflicts across the globe is that many parties are actually fighting by the rules. These quiet, everyday achievements of IHL, a wounded person allowed through a checkpoint, a child who receives food, gets to go to school, detainees who are able to send a message to a loved one or to a family member to let them know where they are and that they're okay. I mean, those are examples that you don't see in the media, and they're not visible to the public, but they're happening every day. So it really can prove that respect for IHL is possible, and it is happening. And it's important not to lose sight of this. And it's something that the ICRC has been trying to do for many years, because we have consistently faced this narrative that IHL is irrelevant. And we want to keep stressing, there are plenty of examples of the positive application of IHL, including by belligerents where they are facing incredible scrutiny in the media, whether it be justified or not. So,
absolutely, and again, I mean, and the accountability that IHL places on belligerents, coupled with the eyes of the world. And this is kind of what I meant by the stick of justice when I kind of alluded to your role initially, Ruben. I never meant that you had this stick in a kinetic sense, but more in the shaming effect of, and I think that really speaks to this kind of road to legitimacy you talked about, this kind of PR sentiment as to why you ought to follow IHL. And again, I mean, I left Sarajevo in the second last UN convoy that ever left the city. And while there were a number of armed groups that danced and played around the convoy and shot around the convoy was ultimately allowed to pass through purely because the world was watching, and it was the UN that was leading Sarajevo. And that has an impact. And that does, despite IHL, being laughed at by some, it does set the conditions that will ultimately shape how conflict will occur. And if the eyes are not there, if the eyes are not upon the belligerents, we also know that things go haywire. Sorry, Ruben, did you want to say something?
I was just going to add that in addition to the formal consequences that you talked about, there's informal consequences that will occur as well. If you're going to not comply with IHL, then you might not face a legal prosecution, but you will be judged in the eyes of the global community. It might be even your own community. It might be your peers who figure that you've dishonored their unit by not conducting yourself in a professional manner. It can be the internal consequences. We know that when civilian harm occurs, if you witness it, if you participate in it, that can lead to mental harm and mental injury. So there are consequences that extend far beyond, and in some cases can be more devastating than going through a judicial procedure. If you're ostracized by your peers, you're outcast by your community, if your mum's not going to speak to you again because, she knows what her son or daughter did on the battlefield, those can be awfully powerful incentives to behave yourself as well.
Yeah. I mean, again, that just reminds me of discussions I had with a researcher on child soldiers and what impact that has, participating in conflict and on a child's development and a sense of belonging to their community, particularly when the community feels ashamed of them for having done some grave atrocities, and how the healing process, an essential component of the healing process, reconciliation is to embrace and embrace the child and in a way forgive, which oftentimes is rather difficult. But you did make a point before, Ruben, about technology, and I definitely do want to touch on it. What role, in your view, does technology play in urban warfare, both in its prosecution but also in managing consequences? We've touched on a couple, so maybe can we hear some examples of how technology, you've seen it play out in urban warfare?
Certainly, technology does have an impact, but probably a lot less than we would imagine. I often hear technology, or the lack of technology, or the lack of capabilities as being an example of or an excuse for not protecting civilians. And frankly, I don't accept that. Many of the measures that we lay out in our handbook and in our discussions with armed groups and state-armed forces is that, understanding the civilian environment, of course, primarily comes from human. It's from talking to those civilians, talking to urban engineers, municipal engineers about how the critical infrastructure is all connected, talking about humanitarians or healthcare professionals about those support, about those civilian considerations, which you're not going to get, from a UAV at 15, 20,000 feet, which is giving you a grainy black and white image. They're not going to tell you, what the civilian population is going to do if there's an attack that's imminent. You don't know what's in the minds, and it comes from humans. So technology can be limited in that respect, but it can also be quite useful. And I think we'll start to see how technology evolves in urban operations. If you're talking about, the use of a multi-million-dollar, medium altitude, long endurance drone or UAV, that's going to be extremely limited in an urban area where it can be negated by a sheet or a tarpaulin, draped across the street. So what I think you'll begin to see is smaller, handheld or hand-launched drones that, through AI operate as a swarm, and that the information that they collect is collated through, an AI sort of driven data or intel fusion to paint a picture. And that can be extremely useful in that lower level granularity can be more useful. But again, it must be complemented by that human element as well. Yeah. When it comes to teaching IHL, as the father of some young kids who are, Gen Zers, and obviously we have Gen Yers out there as well. And, these are people who are now NCOs, young officers, and definitely the young soldiers are all of this generation. And that's where innovative work, I think the Australian Red Cross work on Game of Thrones in terms of, what characters were war criminals because of the actions that they had conducted.
Oh, wow.
And they spread that out through social media. And
I haven't seen that. That's great.
Yeah, it's really good and conveys the message of IHL, the elements of it, and the general principles that underpin it to a younger audience who may not be familiar with IHL. Other technology, for example, within my unit here, we've developed a virtual reality tool that's effectively a first-person shooter experience that a individual soldier can patrol through an urban area and are faced with IHL sort of based decisions, and it can be as simple as engage or not engage as they're patrolling through an urban area, and they're faced with scenarios that challenge or get them to practice their application of IHL. We're not going to be able to, accompany every soldier on an urban jungle lane. Excuse the paradox there, but you know what I mean. But we can do that virtually. We can put them in a classroom and walk them through that,
and at least start the process of conditioning for the right responses.
Yeah, and again, when we go back to the pedagogical approaches, that practice is going to be far more effective than if we just, lecture them from the front of the room with PowerPoint.
And just out of interest, I mean, how do you then reach out to militaries and offer that virtual reality game? How does it get to the end user?
Yep. So exactly that. Our delegates, and we've got some 80 odd armed forces delegates around the world, have this laptop loaded up, an image enhanced to laptop to deliver this. And so it will normally be part of a lesson where we can give them the rules and then give them a chance to practice it. And often you can find, you put someone in that setting where their peers are around them, and there's a bit of a competitive spirit. They all want to engage. They all want to be like a lot of soldiers, a step ahead of their peers. And so you can foster that competitive spirit to do better at IHL in this environment.
Very interesting. I suspect you already have somebody with the Australian Defence Force, I'd imagine. Okay, excellent. And Abby, from your view, how does technology kind of play in all of this from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question. I think there's, in terms of the future of urban warfare, there's a lot of people writing about how technology is going to really change how urban warfare is fought in the future. I'm not entirely sure if that's the case or not. It's to be seen. I think one of the things that we talk about, in terms of a positive kind of aspect of technology, and what we would like to see, states and militaries develop more of or improve their technology to know and understand the battle space better, and in order to get that information to the decision makers and quickly, right? Because we know that very often, particularly in urban settings, it's the individual soldier, the JTAC, the ground force commander, at the tactical level, really making some pretty serious decisions in terms of where to drop munitions. And we have done a long line of work, and in the field as well as advocacy here, or in with governments and in the UN and the like on, the disruption of essential services and the protection of critical infrastructure in cities. And, because this really is one of the really core issues when it comes to urban warfare, right? So, your electricity, health, water and sanitation, food production, education, there's some really core essential services. And, the critical infrastructure that sustains those services are often damaged during the hostilities, either deliberately or, as collateral damage. Sometimes the services are actually denied by warring parties as part of their strategy. And so, and also essential services might be vulnerable to cyber operations, particularly if, they are, the essential service systems are not secured by design. And so, we would really kind of, quite encouraged by types of work being done in order to really improve the soldier, from all the way down the tactical level through to the strategic, their kind of understanding of what is the infrastructural laydown of the city. What is the most critical ground and above ground and below ground infrastructure. What really makes this city run? Because when you think about essential services, right, they are interdependent. So the failure of one can result in the collapse of many. So you have electricity is needed for water and sanitation, as an example. Hospitals and schools need safe water, sanitation, and electricity. And so when systems like this fail, the scale of the humanitarian consequences really do exceed anything that humanitarian action alone can fix. And it is a real problem when it comes to fighting in urban areas, in terms of, we see heavy explosive weapons really cause a lot of damage to this critical infrastructure. And sometimes it's because, the person who's calling in the airstrike doesn't know that the type of infrastructure that they're going to hit is going to cause such significant harm. And so, that's really, I think, where there could be a value from technology in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that just reminds me again of my conversation with Mark Alesko, who actually put me in touch originally with you, Abby, and spoke exceptionally highly of you. But he was the chief targetee for the Pentagon during the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and he speaks about the 50 attempts at striking Saddam remotely, and 0 out of 50 obviously were successful, but every one of those killed civilians, which kind of speaks to that understanding the environment, getting a much better picture of where is it that you're dropping ordnance, and what is the likely effect, and again speaks to the limitations of technology in many ways as well that you touched on, Ruben, and the need and reliance on humans and the people on the ground to actually understand what is the intent. While Saddam might have been somewhere, he was a conscious actor that was, exercising his agency and moving around and deceiving, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a really, really interesting piece. And one other aspect that I really would like to touch on, and also conscious of our time now, but maybe one that's, I don't know, is it sensitive? Is it touchy? Is it, I'm not sure what the right word is, but I've also interviewed Samuel Moyne, who's the author of the book called Humane: How the US Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. And the thesis and the argument in the book is that focus on IHL has made war more palatable to some nations. And he uses the US as an example, because theoretically, at least, precision munitions and special forces, which are a result of international humanitarian law pressure on belligerents, have made war become more humane. And, for that very reason, have also made war a lot more palatable or a far more easier tool to turn to, because of the seeming, lack of impact on civilians. What do you both think of this hypothesis? And he is even in his book, he does draw the distinction of how, originally IHL was very pacifist in his approach, and then kind of because it argued for let's just ban war, full stop. But because of pressures and the realities on the ground, it went with, okay, well, we can't ban war, so now let's make war more humane. And then, of course, we have this kind of offshoot effect. I don't know who wants to start us off on this one. Both of you are cringing.
Well, I can have a crack for sure. I mean, I'm glad that I really enjoyed the episode you did with Mark. I think he raised a lot of really good points. And particularly when it comes to the issue of precision, he raised a couple of really valid points going, well, no matter how precise your weapon is, and how accurate you might be on what you're targeting, it's going to depend on the quality of your intelligence, and the size of your bomb and the nature of your target to really determine how much civilian harm you're going to be causing. And I think it's a really important point when you hear people talk about the value and merits of precision, particularly if you're using precision across, an entire urban battle space that will end up with the same type of outcome as, unguided, bunch of unguided bombs. I think on Samuel Moyne's argument, I have listened to a couple of the podcasts about the book, including yours, and I'm yet to read it fully. It certainly sounds like an interesting book with quite a US-centric focus. I have heard it has generated some controversy, and I'm not surprised by this. If I understand the argument or the premise of the argument you described correctly, it's essentially this, that through IHL, we have essentially legitimized the war effort at the expense of prioritizing peace and prohibiting war altogether. And because IHL seeks to make war more humane, the legal framework is to blame for why conflicts don't end. And, if that is the premise of the argument, it's certainly not the first time that I've heard an author question the role of IHL. But I think, to be honest, you're going to have a hard time convincing me of it. But I might need to read the book still, though. I think I would make a couple of points. And the first one being, let us not forget that generations of international lawyers have devoted their careers to outlawing war by law. And those efforts have been unsuccessful so far. So, I mean, yes, the UN Charter does prohibit war, right? So through Article 2.4. But you can't simply just ignore the fact that there are two exceptions when the Security Council can authorize the use of force collectively. So that's, to restore international peace and security, and for the individual or collective self-defense in the case of an armed attack against a member state. We also can't forget that the UN Charter does not address the use of force in non-international armed conflicts, and we know that they are occurring across the globe. So that armed conflict occurs is a fact. And so, is it not a moral imperative to have some limits in the absence of peace, is what I would say. And I think, history also shows us that unrestrained warfare would almost certainly cause large-scale horrors and be an ineffective way of fighting a war. So that's the first point. I think the second point I would say is, let's be clear about what IHL is as a body of law and its mandate. IHL is agnostic as to the reasons why someone starts an armed conflict in the first place. It doesn't authorize it, legitimize it, and it certainly doesn't encourage its duration, and it doesn't express a view on how to end a war. And it is a pragmatic, albeit imperfect, framework to manage what is essentially an exceptional situation involving extreme violence. So, and its purpose being to reduce the suffering for those not participating in the hostilities. It doesn't stop all the suffering, we know this, but it does stop some of it. So the real genius of IHL, and the reason why it's been universally accepted by states as a body of law, is that when the rules were codified, the military were included in the conversation. The laws weren't adopted until they agreed. And that was the only way we were going to get those laws. And so as for who's to blame for decisions to start a conflict or not to end one, let's not use IHL as a scapegoat. Those are political decisions that rest with parties to armed conflict. Institutions such as the UN, and in particular the Security Council, are charged to deal with those questions, at least on paper. And they give rise to legal issues that exist in other bodies of public international law. That is not IHL. And I would be interested to see some more empirical evidence to demonstrate that by making wars more intense and brutal and awful, that it's going to bring about their swift and decisive end. I'm not convinced.
I might have misrepresented his argument. I don't think he makes that argument. Nor is he as critical of IHL as I might have made it sound. In fact, he's not at all. It's just that he's saying that, at the cost of appeasement. In other words, we know the war is going to happen, so hey, let's at least try and make it more humane. A second order effect of that is that whilst all noble, and Samuel will be the first to say that these are noble efforts, and of course, a humane war is better than a non-humane war. But in his argument, it's definitely not better than a no war, and that's of course that's a bit of a no shit statement. But what the point is then ultimately making is that because we have made war seemingly humane, it becomes a much more easily palatable decision for the decision makers who you rightly accuse as the ones who are responsible. And I couldn't agree more with you. It becomes a lot more palatable for them to say, hey, let's go to Iraq, we'll do precision strikes, we won't hit any civilians. Let's, get rid of Saddam, going for a quick victory because, we have all these precision guided munitions and or we'll send special forces, et cetera, which ultimately we now know is, of course, never the full picture, but it's sold oftentimes as that. And I think that's perhaps the, more what his argument is, that I might have misrepresented him.
No, I mean, and maybe, and I've probably completely, and as I said, I've definitely. No,
I love your response. I totally love your response.
I might have completely misunderstood. I just say, I guess the question I ask is, well, what's the alternative to not having IHL? And I think, I'm just not convinced by an argument, and it might not be the one that Samuel Moyn makes, is that, by raising the price of admission to a war through unrestrained violence is the solution to ending them, and to bring us the promise of peace. So it is a tricky argument.
I think he's trying to revamp the argument or reignite the commitment to and pressure, original commitment to banning of war. Facing that reality or tackling that reality, as opposed to accepting that war is going to happen and therefore let's make it more humane. If you know what I mean. I think that's his kind of cognitive push that is trying to let's put the no war, ban war position back on the table of a pacifist, rather than accepting that war is an inevitable, self-evident truth of the human species, and therefore, we make it, and that kind of gets us down this kind of cascading option of war being humane. So, Ruben, you were going to jump in as well.
Yeah, I think it's worth adding that the employment of remote warfare to make it more palatable has very little to do with IHL. What makes it palatable is the fact that there are a lack of friendly force casualties. So be it through the use of drones, SF, proxy forces, and the like. What makes it palatable to the domestic audience, and that's who we're addressing here, is the fact that body bags are not going to come home. Of course, that raises a risk as well in terms of if there's less risk being applied to the force as a whole, and there's that distance, it can create a dissonance or dehumanization to the conduct of warfare, and that's a whole other argument in regards to war being a battle of wills, a contest between human groups, and I think the human element of that needs to be kept at the forefront of our understanding of warfare.
Yeah, and you're right. He does talk a lot about drones and its usage, and exactly that point. We don't see what happens. And I think he uses Pakistan and Afghanistan as an example. But it looks like this has struck a chord with you, Abby. But I think you've got something else to say. Please do.
No.
I was hoping you would, which is why I asked.
Yeah, I mean, you probably. Yeah, I think that was. It's not surprising that someone who spent a long time around the body of IHL would have those reactions, and I think that is kind of the intent, as I understand, of the book, and similar authors that have said similar things, particularly those in the argument of pacifism and that movement, which is a very an important one. And I think from what I understand, it's really interesting comments made about Henri Dunant and Monier's role, in the early days of developing, the IHL kind of rules and the ICRC and what's their role is, both in the jus in bello and the jus ad bellum context. So I'm looking forward to reading the book. It's been on my list for many years, for quite some months now, and I have not had a chance to read it, but I definitely need to.
It's controversial, but it's definitely some food for thought there anyway. I often say I'm as close as one can be as a pacifist while wearing a uniform, because I recognize, much like you described it, there are oftentimes absolute necessities, unfortunately, it seems, with the human species, that we need to resort to war, as grave as it may be. But I am in the camp of those who think that oftentimes we choose that option a little too easily, and oftentimes forgetting. And I was a civilian in war, and my life and where I am now is a consequence of a war, experienced by a child. So I can empathize with that position from a very, very personal level, because I do think that we tend to, jump to the war as being a solution a little too easily. But maybe sorry, please.
So just to say on that, and I think partly maybe that's because, maybe not taking into account just those extremely, serious and long-lasting consequences of warfare on the civilian population, those effects that are not really easily seen, once you leave a battle space. I mean, the consequences, the dangers for civilians from urban warfare, for example, right? They are long-lasting and they're not immediately visible. They affect civilians in very different ways, particularly, and it differs depending on whether they remain in the city at war, they leave their homes and cross front lines, or they're displaced. And the consequences for them reverberate for decades, after the conflict ends and militaries leave. And I think that is certainly something that the ICRC wants to stress to belligerents when they're making decisions to get involved in conflicts, what exactly that means for civilians.
Yeah, because and this was in fact a question that I had for you that I wanted to ask, but there are a number of second and third order effects that we don't discuss, and you've kind of hit a couple. If you've got a few more minutes, I'm happy to hear, what are some of those other second and third order, consequences that is civilians experience as a result of urban warfare.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think we touched upon a couple of them throughout the discussions. I mean, obviously, the ones from all of the damage and destruction that's caused from the use of heavy explosive weapons being one. They reverberate well beyond the weapon's initial impact zone. The effects on essential services is another one. And the couple of things, one of the things I didn't mention was that, in order to have essential services run, you don't just need the critical infrastructure, you need the people and the consumables and supplies. And when it comes to the people, the essential service personnel that you need to maintain and run infrastructure, they might flee the conflict. They might be harmed while trying to do their job. There's this incredible level of brain drain as a result of protracted hostilities. And so there's no one qualified to repair a lot of this infrastructure. And then when it comes to the supply parts, your consumables you need in order to fix it, a lot of that's held up by sanctions regimes, counterterrorism measures that are taken. And so, it's difficult to get those in. So that's one aspect. And I think another point was the mass displacement. It really is, a decision for a civilian to flee a conflict zone is a self-protection measure, but it is one that comes with significant risk all along the way of that displacement. You know, they might face ill treatment as they flee, subjected to pretty harsh screening measures. And then even when they do reach where they are displaced to, whether it be to another city or within the city or a camp, you know, they still need to find a place to live, employment, and then sometimes they're prevented from returning. And I'm not just talking about months. I mean, it's years because, you know, there might be unexploded weapon contamination and lack of essential services, and they've got no homes to go to. So, and that's so there are some really long-lasting reverberating effects.
Yeah. Ruben?
And these are all interconnected and flow on to one another. And you can start with with an seemingly innocuous event like, you know, an airstrike that damages, you know, an office or something like that. But that means that those individuals might not have a source of income. Okay, it means that they have less money coming into their families. It means their families have less access to food at a time when those food prices are, are probably rising. And I know, Maz, I'm preaching to the converted here, because you know this full well. But the sort of downward spiral that accumulates that harm and that risk over time as the situation becomes more and more dire and they become more and more vulnerable. And I think it's important to realize too that there are members of society that are more vulnerable than others. So if we look at the elderly and the disabled, for example, they at the start of a conflict, they're on the back foot. You know, they might not be able to hear the warnings that are being delivered by radio or telephone. They might be disabled. They might not be able to move themselves. We know this when it comes to the evacuations of cities, that it's critical that they understand that despite an evacuation, there are civilians who will remain behind because for whatever reason they just cannot evacuate. They've reached the point where, you know, they are unable to leave their homes for whatever reason. So there's a number of, in fact, a very sad but long list of humanitarian consequences that occur from urban warfare, but they do feed on each other and can spiral quite dramatically out of control.
Yeah, and I really like that point that you made about the loss of income and you know, as a result of hostilities. I mean, this is something that I think we didn't learn, and I put myself in this camp as well. You know, during my time in Afghanistan, you know, we forgot that war had an impact on the local population, and they often would look to make a living in whichever way they could, which oftentimes included bringing parts for an IED on behalf of this mythical organization we refer to as the Taliban, which we still don't really, you know, understand exactly what that might have meant. But we would straight away paint that person with the same brush as the same Taliban sitting in Quetta in Pakistan. And of course, that's a mistake, because when we prosecute that individual as a target, you know, we're not necessarily seeing, you know, the true motivations for them participating. But we might have made you know, them a martyr now, and of course have turned members of their family against you know, the coalition effort and so on. So that's kind of another aspect that really kind of triggered in my mind as you said it, because I certainly, you know, have probably made that very same mistake. But maybe my last question to you both. What I say, maybe three things, if you can think of three on the spot, that make your jobs particularly difficult, or in other words, what are three things you'd like military and other armed group decision makers to think about when considering or conducting urban warfare? So these are kind of your lessons learned based on your experience, you know, that those partaking in urban warfare can take away.
Can we do one each? Because asking for three off the bat is just not fair, Maz.
That's a very fair call. Let's go with one each.
So I think I'd start by asking all military personnel, be they belong to an armed group or a state armed force, to put themselves in the shoes of the civilians in the area that they are operating, and think of themselves foremost as sons, daughters, brothers, to better understand, what it is that the civilian population goes through. That they are in need, like you pointed out through your anecdote. They are in need of income. The children are in need of education, advancement. They are in need of basics, water, food, health supplies, medical support, and think through all of the elements of that process, be it the training, be it the planning, be it the conduct of what would it like to be a civilian in the urban area or even a rural area in which they're about to conduct those hostilities. So that's number one from me.
Yeah, that's absolutely wonderful. I just make a comment on it because that again speaks to me so strongly, because by trying to put yourself in the shoes of those, in that particular urban setting, you're developing empathy. You're developing a sense of relatedness to them, and you're recognizing very soon that, hey, their needs are absolutely the same as my needs. And if my city was under siege, I would be doing the same thing most likely. And of course, just by developing empathy, you're humanizing them, and making them, or you're doing the opposite of what dehumanization does, which of course then leads you to becoming more desensitized to IHL or atrocities in general. So absolutely, absolutely spoke to me really, really strongly. So thanks for that, Ruben. That was great. Abby?
This is exactly why I wanted Ruben to come on the podcast with me, because he's always much more eloquent than anything I can say. So, I mean, just to echo everything that Ruben has said, and following on from that, I think, whether we like it or not, the future of warfare is going to be urban, and it's still going to be destructive, no matter what forms of technological advancement happens, and advancements in precision. And so, I think what I would like, all states and non-state armed groups to think about how to conduct them better, to better protect them for civilians, and that really does start well before you end up in the urban battle, and to prioritize it in training, in doctrine. In training and doctrine and war games. I mean, those are tabletop exercises. They are super important types of exercises to kind of talk through a lot of the challenges that might arise. To take the training beyond the level of door kicking and to the level of that operational level of planning and the strategic level, and go, look, what do we need to think about in order to ensure that the soldiers that we are sending in to battle, or the sailors or the air people to support this war, and what do we need to have them thinking about now, and how do we need to resource them in terms of force and then force composition and all of those considerations, but with the view of what is best to protect civilians.
Yeah. And again, I must emphasize this wasn't staged in any way, but the fact that I'm now in the doctrine world, again, that really speaks to me and resonates with me. And I couldn't agree more. And I will, I can make you the pledge that I will quietly share both those publications that you've mentioned to my peers and circle them around as publications are being drafted. But I will also attach them to the show notes of this podcast, because I think they're both fantastic resources for the enormous amount of work that has gone into thinking about this problem, which it's a real problem. And on that note, I do want to thank you both, firstly, personally, as I keep alluding to, as a child of urban warfare, ultimately, of a siege, for the work that you're doing to help those who are in very similar circumstances today, but also who will be in those circumstances tomorrow. So on a personal level, I want to thank you both. But then, of course, I want to thank you for giving me so much of your time. I know we've gone well beyond our originally agreed time frame. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your experiences on this sad but very important topic.
I mean, I just want to say thank you so much for the invitation, Maz. Your podcast is excellent. I've listened to so many of the episodes and I really enjoy them. And so thank you so much for putting it out there and having, really interesting and important discussions with a bunch of really interesting folks. So thanks for the chance to join.
Thanks, Abby.
Yeah, no, and I would just reiterate that, especially if you do get the opportunity, please invite more ethicists and behavioural change experts on. Your interviews with Dave Wetham, Dean Peter Baker, Shannon French, those are all exactly the area of work that I'm extremely interested in and want to pursue in the future. So, yeah, well done, and please keep it up.
No, thank you very much. Well, you'll be pleased to know that I've got another 3 ethicists, 4 locked in for the next 3 months. So plenty more of that topic to come. Once again, both, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. All the best. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Voices of War. And since you got this far, please consider showing your support by liking and reviewing the show wherever you catch your pods. Also, if you're able, please consider showing your support through our Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee page. Links to both are in the show notes. Thank you, and until next time.